Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Ida V. Escamani. I am Senior Director of the Legislative Affairs Team at the State Innovation Exchange, or SIX for short. We're so grateful to have over 200 registrants for this conversation today: legislators, legislative staff, advocacy partners, grassroots organizations from over 40 states across the country. And this briefing, as y'all know, is titled Funding Our Futures: Tax Justice in the States. We are going to get started very soon because we have a packed conversation for you all. But we are asking that you go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. So please pop in your name, your position, your location, and any organization that you are associated with. And I want to remind folks that this briefing is being recorded. And we will be sending out this presentation along with the recording following this conversation. That is so essential at this time. In the interest of time, we're going to get started as folks sign on. We already have 94 participants here, so super grateful for folks carving out the time. So at SIX, we organize and empower a growing network of over 1,800 state legislators across the country committed to building people-centered state government. And we are so grateful to have you here and to host this briefing in collaboration with our partners at the State Revenue Alliance. This crew knows this already. The Trump administration is initiating the largest transfer of wealth from the working class to the billionaire class. But in this moment, states offer an opportunity. States are where we can do what the Trump administration refuses to do: pass common sense tax policy to fund programs working families depend on by making sure the ultra wealthy and corporations pay their fair share in taxes. It's a simple and widely popular idea, but we're up against some of the most powerful interests in the world and the dire consequences of Trump's big, ugly mega bill. And of course, increasing racial and class wealth disparities in this country by design. That is why it is essential that state legislators, grassroots organizations, and policy experts are working together in deep collaboration towards tax justice in the states. It's also why we need to bring in more organizations and issue experts into the tax fight. No matter your area of policy expertise, the tax fight is your fight, and we need you here. This conversation is designed to build on the momentum of tax justice initiatives in states across the country. So this is a 90-minute, two-part briefing. The first part will be an overview of state tax progress, challenges, and trends provided by our friends at the State Revenue Alliance. The second part will be a panel conversation featuring state legislators and advocacy leaders across the country, led by state senator and SIX consultant, Senator Noel Frame of Washington State. That conversation will share lessons on the most recent legislative session and strategies for how states can lead on revenue right now and in the future. We ask that you share your questions in the chat or the Q&A function of the webinar. We will be monitoring those and working to get to as many as we can. And again, for those hopping on just now, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. And with that, I will pass the virtual mic to Amber Wallen, Executive Director of the State Revenue Alliance.
Thanks so much, Ida, and hi everyone. It's so good to be with you during this. What's a trying time, but a time when I think we're all really leaning into love and care for our communities and each other, and so it's so good to be doing that with all of you. I'm Amber. I'm the Executive Director of the State Revenue Alliance and our C4 affiliate, the Alliance Action Fund. And for those who don't know SRA, at the State Revenue Alliance, we work with state-based grassroots, policy and labor organizations across the country who are pushing for more equitable and just tax policies that better support the programs and services that matter most to our families and communities. And at SRA, we're driven by this belief that you see here, alongside incredible partners in Pennsylvania, that as wonky as it can get, tax policy is and should be, must be people policy. There's that quote, "Show me your budget and I'll show you what you value." And we believe the same that is true for budgets is true for tax policy, that how we raise and spend our money, how much we raise, who pays what they owe, who benefits the most, and whether a tax code is moving people closer to or further away from racial and gender equity, all of these things demonstrate what we value and are moral choices that are and must be guided by the people that are most impacted by them. But unfortunately, the reality is, as you can see on the next slide, that for far too long, tax policy has been an area where regular community members have been too often shut out, And the wealthy and the well-connected have had outsized power in influencing tax codes to become upside down and anemic, not raising the robust and stable revenues that states really need to support the programs that matter most to families because so many tax handouts have gone to the richest, the wealthiest, the biggest corporations. And that has made our state tax codes more regressive, more racially inequitable, and skewed towards the wealthy as a result. And so you can see that on this chart from our incredible partners at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, or ITEP. And in the fact that the vast majority, 44, of state and local tax systems are regressive or upside down when you consider the various taxes that households pay in these states. So you can see here, 41 states save their lowest overall effective tax rates for the richest earners. 34 states tax low-income earners at higher rates than any other income group, and only 6 states and the District of Columbia reserve their lowest overall tax rates for their lowest income residents. And of course, you can see on the next slide, we know that the recently passed federal tax plan will only exacerbate these inequities because the enormously expensive, big, disgraceful tax and budget bill that was recently passed and signed in DC includes, as you can see on this chart again from ITEP, that massive tax cuts in the bill will overwhelmingly benefit the richest Americans, with more than 70% of the tax cuts in the bill going to really high earners. And of course, we know that this incredibly expensive tax cut package is being paid for through measures that will very much harm our families and cloud their futures in a really tangible way. Through 150,000 federal layoffs, through tariffs that will cost the average family thousands of dollars each year, and most significantly through cuts to essential health, education, food, and safety net programs that families and communities depend on every single day. Some of those cuts will cause more than 20 million families to lose some or all of their food support benefits and cause at least 10 million residents to lose their health insurance, amongst the many other harms that this bill will cause. And not only are these federal spending and program cuts and changes to health and safety net programs, not only will they be hurting our families and communities pretty immediately, but they'll also put enormous strain on state budgets across the country. And we know this is harmful because states are very reliant on federal funding for essential programs, with about a third of state budgets coming from federal funding. And so we know, and our state partners know, and state lawmakers that you're going to hear from later on this call know that state budgets will be facing enormous pressures across the country due to these massive funding cuts to key programs, especially for safety net programs like Medicaid and SNAP, due to bad economic policies that increase costs for families, due to inflation and recession threats that continue to increase with every trade war and wave of layoffs. And the fact that federal COVID aid is fully expiring for states and adding that the broad tax cuts that many states gave away during the last few years when they had relatively flush budgets. All of those things will be coming into the states at the same time and mean that many states will face budget shortfalls and will absolutely be shouldering more responsibility for essential programs and services at the same time that our communities need those programs and services the most. But all of that said, um, I also really want to stress that there's good news too. There is reason to hope, reason to believe, and real tangible evidence to point to that we do have a bright future and that we have the tools, the foundation, and the strengths that we need to build it, and that we, alongside national and state partners, are actively doing so at this very moment. And so you can see that I think is the biggest bright light to point to right now on this front is that groups all across the country are building these important essential foundations. We are seeing and working with communities across the states that are recognizing tax policy for the immense power that it has to improve equity and create opportunity and fully fund bright futures for our families. And each year and each month, more and more people and organizations are rising against wealth inequity, and injustice. In this year alone, groups like Fair Share America and the State Revenue Alliance helped support incredible state leaders in holding more than 200 organizing events across the country, calling for tax fairness and for tax justice. And that tax movement continues to grow in both speed and power. And we're seeing that power reflected in a number of different ways. One of them in the fact that state tax justice advocates and lawmaker champions are very actively moving the Overton window on taxes and actually shifting and improving the narrative in favor of tax justice issues. So what you see here, and SRA does very detailed tracking on this front, what you see here is negative versus positive media coverage of state tax justice issues in the first quarter of the past 3 years. So you can see kind of what that looks like. And while generally state tax media coverage is mostly neutral, in the past, for the stories that do lean one way or the other, negative stories have far outweighed the ones that we would consider as tax justice advocates, that we'd consider positive. So you can see that in 2023, when negative stories outpaced positive ones by a very large margin. A margin that then shrunk in 2024, and that pretty remarkably, and for the first time since we've been tracking this, saw that tax justice and pro-revenue messages and themes in state level media actually beat out anti-tax stories this year. And that's a trend that continues in quarter 2 of this year as well, and we'll be sharing out that media report soon. But really important narrative progress. And then pretty notably, you can see here, we're also seeing that movement momentum. So again, things that are not always easy to measure in other ways, but we're seeing that movement momentum start to be reflected in policy and electoral outcomes. So Erica's going to share more about this year's legislative outcomes in just a few minutes, but they come on the heels of voters approving more than $40 billion in new state revenue on the ballot last year. So some of that revenue was through important revenue ballot measures that were won or preserved in states like Colorado and Utah and Washington and Illinois. And I'll just say that's also on top of major legislative revenue wins in states like New Jersey and Maine and New Mexico. But on the electoral front in 2024, that also influenced policy outcomes, policy momentum, and challenges that states felt this year and will next. But in 2024 elections, we saw that state electoral outcomes were actually also pretty positive for revenue and tax justice champions that we work with that were on the ballot, that we work with on both the C3 and C4 side in November. Out of the 50 tax champion policymakers that State Revenue Alliance was tracking in November, nearly all, 47 out of 50, won their races, including all incumbents. And every state legislator that was up for election from the Tax Justice Initiative cohort that we at SRA convened with our great partners at Six, there was 38 legislators and they all won their races. So all of these things we think bode well, not just for legislative opportunities on equitable tax and budget policies, but also for 2026, when alongside, of course, crucial congressional midterms, 36 governor's seats will be up for election. 88 out of 99 state legislatures will be up for election across 46 states. And when we know that more very important measures will be on the ballot. So, just to wrap up before I turn it over to Erica, I would say, I've been in state tax work for almost 15 years, and this is, I think, a pretty exciting time to be doing this because we're not only seeing growth and movement indicators like growing diversity and number of groups engaged, and in the way that narratives are gradually but steadily improving. And that's during a really trying time, but those things are improving at the same time that we are also seeing some concrete shifts in electoral outcomes and improvements in legislative outcomes, which you're going to hear more about from Erica. So, big picture, while incredibly harmful policy changes from the federal level are looming over states and over our communities and will continue to do so as federal funding programs changes and cuts roll out through the next year. And while we are up against powerful and extremely well-funded opposition anti-tax actors who are very happy to stoke fires of division and hate, but who know that defeating tax justice issues is actually their most important source of bread and butter and security. Alongside those challenges, we also know we are seeing and feeling, and collectively with you all driving a transformative change in tax justice issues, where the cross-country estate tax movement is becoming increasingly diverse and engaged in ways that is unique, that is new, and that is starting to improve outcomes. Will certainly do so in the future because more and more folks are recognizing just how deeply and inextricably connected tax justice is to preserving our democracy and ensuring that our babies and families have the supports and opportunities that they need to thrive, that our classrooms are fully funded, that our cities and counties are healthy, and that our air and water are clean. And so in this moment of turmoil and hurt, but also of resistance and resilience and opportunity, we know that states are incredible and essential and relatively remarkably accessible labs of democracy and innovation that are on the front lines of tax justice. And on those front lines, our partners and our communities, organizers, advocates, policymakers alike are exploring what a fair and equitable tax code could and should look like in the future that we are all collectively pushing for and building. And so with that, to hear more about those strategies and that movement, I'm going to turn it over to the incredible Erica Wozniak, our wonderful legislative director at State Revenue Alliance. Take it away, Erica.
Sorry, forgot to unmute. Thank you, Amber and Ida, for that introduction and context setting. My name is Erica Wozniak. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as the legislative director at SRA. I come to this work with a unique background. I was an elementary school teacher in Chicago Public Schools and a union steward for the Chicago Teachers Union for 15 years. I then served as chief of staff to a city council member, and in 2023, I worked as a senior political advisor on my fellow union brother and teacher Brandon Johnson's successful campaign for mayor of Chicago. Like you, I felt the constant frustration of never having enough to give the best public service to the thousands of students that I was charged with educating and constituents I was tasked with providing services for. Those experiences led me into this revenue advocacy work because this is how we fund our communities. SRA began tracking key pieces of legislation in 2023 when we, alongside SIX, started the Tax Justice Initiative, or TJI. As you can see, there has been huge progress. The bills that we track and the data that you will see today comes directly from and is vetted by our state partners. This is by no means a comprehensive list, and we know that you all have bills and wins and defensive work that just will not be captured in this presentation. But we do want to showcase what our partners are doing, and we hope that this work will be beneficial to you all in your understanding of what's happening across the country in tax justice and revenue raising spaces. TJI is a collective effort of state legislators, labor partners, community leaders, and advocates coordinating across state lines to build a national movement for tax justice. With support from SIX and SRA, TJI is united in a common cause for our communities and focuses on enacting policies where the ultra-wealthy pay what they owe in taxes. TJI began with 9 states in 2023 and went to 13 states in 2024, and this year we have 15 states. Momentum continues to grow at the state level amongst legislators and advocates alike. In the past, tax work has been done primarily in partnerships with the groups who are focused on policy. At SRA, we believe that running strong revenue campaigns requires engaging all 3 legs of the stool, which to us is policy, labor, and community-based organizations who represent those who are most harmed by racist tax systems, the workers who have been left out of tax policy, and the families who depend on funding for their communities. In order to win, the table has to be long and it must be inclusive. We are up against a long history of exclusion and tax codes that have been designed to benefit those who created them, individuals who have historically been white and wealthy. It is past time that we reverse that order. And overwhelmingly, members of our community support tax justice. Last year, SRA worked with Data for Progress to produce polling not just at the national level, but by state, congressional, and each state House and Senate districts. These are results from just some example districts for one question that we asked on support for raising taxes for earners who make more than $400,000 a year. As you can see across the board, voters believe that high earners should pay more in taxes. This is just one of the questions we polled and modeled. We did many others, all of which are available by state legislative districts on our website. We encourage you to use and access this available data, which shows how strongly voters in your communities support more tax fairness. Our vision of what tax justice means is a world where our communities have the resources they need to thrive, and those who can afford to pay the most are contributing their fair share. We have a lot more to do to reach our goals on any number of issues or levels. So next, I am going to review the legislation and their stories that you and your colleagues moved in your states in 2025 that help move us towards our vision. Again, this list is not comprehensive to all 50 states. These are examples of bills that SRA partners have shared with us and that we supported state partners on during the 2025 legislative session. As we did last year in our follow-up email, we will be sharing a document with a full list of all of the bills that we tracked in 2025 for your reference, which we of course encourage you to use and share with your colleagues and partners. Again, these numbers reflect the bills that SRA supported and is not comprehensive to all 50 states. But in 2025 alone, we tracked over 105 pieces of legislation that had over 1,027 legislative champions alongside 225 coalition partners, and 21 of those bills are now law. Just look at the creativity the partners are leading on tax justice. Over 40 different kinds of revenue bills were proposed this year alone. We know that this is not a complete list, but it is a snapshot of the bills partners shared with us in 2025. Taxes on high earners, specifically on individuals making over $1 million, have been receiving a lot of movement and attention this session. Of the partners SRA worked closely with, more than 10 high earner tax bills were introduced across at least 8 states. We are seeing these bills have more co-sponsors and support amongst legislative leaders. Not only did many receive hearings and move out of committees, but in a number of states, they passed one or both chambers. Maryland passed an income tax increase on people with incomes over $500,000 and $1 million. Maine had two tax bills on high earners. The first would have added 2 additional top-tier income tax brackets, which passed both the House and the Senate. And the second, which would have added a 2% surcharge to incomes over $1 million, which also passed the Senate. In Rhode Island, they considered an additional 3% tax on income over $625,000. This bill had significant momentum and support from the Senate president, but it did not pass this session. As income inequality continues to grow, we've seen increasing recognition that high income earners tax bills, adding new tax brackets and surcharges on high earners, are major revenue raisers and powerful opportunities to ensure those making the most are paying their fair share. Just last month, the Massachusetts governor signed a $1.3 billion supplemental budget bill in surplus funds raised from their millionaires tax, building on the $2.46 billion generated in the law's first full fiscal year. Since Massachusetts' Fair Share Amendment was passed by popular vote on the ballot, it's grown even more popular and continuing to prove that progressive taxes on the wealthy are good for everyone. In fact, in 2025, Massachusetts saw its largest population increase in 60 years. It was ranked the strongest state economy in the country, and it rose 10 spots on the list of fairest state tax systems. And through our work with the Institute for Policy Studies and state partners, we know that there are more millionaires in Massachusetts than before the Fair Share Amendment was effectuated. Here we include both explicit wealth taxes, which are taxes based on the total value of an individual's assets minus liabilities, as well as capital gains taxes. At least 3 states, Washington, New York, and Rhode Island, introduced wealth taxes. Only a couple of years ago, these types of policies felt insurmountable, but now, thanks to the people on this call, there is very real momentum. Washington passed a wealth tax to the Senate, an effort led by our own Senator Frame, one of the creators of TJI. Later on, you will hear from her as she facilitates our panel discussion. This historic movement and an increase in the number of bills introduced to tax wealth builds on years and years of organizing from legislators and advocates to prove the seriousness and legitimacy of a wealth tax like theirs, which would have enacted a 1% tax on stocks and bonds in excess of $50 million. A wealth tax was also included in the proposed budget of outgoing Governor Jay Inslee and included in the proposed budget of the legislature. Our friends in Washington demonstrated what is possible this session. More than 5 states had active capital gains bills moving. In Hawaii, they passed a bill out of the House and out of the Senate Ways and Means Committee. In Connecticut and Maine, advocates turned out in force for bill hearings, and the Connecticut House Finance Committee included a version of capital gains in their proposed budget. This year, there is a trend where taxes on wealth move from an idea into key bills at the heart of state budget debates, with hundreds of legislators signing on as sponsors and co-sponsors. Our report with the Institute for Policy Studies also found that following the passage of a capital gains tax in Washington, the number of wealthy individuals and their overall wealth grew, which was a trend in their findings with wealth tax policies in other states. Taxes on property and estate taxes also saw significant movement this year. New Jersey passed a realty transfer fee on property sales over $2 million. Maine passed an increase to its real estate transfer tax from $2.20 to $6 per $500 for real estate sales over $1 million to fund affordable housing construction. Rhode Island introduced a tax on non-owner occupied second homes assessed in excess of $1 million, which became affectionately known as the Taylor Swift tax, since she owns a $28 million home there. Montana also passed property tax reform, establishing a tiered rate structure, lowering the residential tax rate for principal residents and establishing a higher rate for second and high value homes. We saw more than 11 bills from as many states related to taxes on property and estates. As demonstrated by the multiple bills passed and pushed for by state partners, these types of property and estate taxes are compelling ways to target the wealth held in high-value properties and close loopholes too often taken advantage of by wealthy developers and high-income individuals. We saw 17 corporate tax bills introduced across 13 states. Here we include corporate income taxes, worldwide combined reporting, global intangible low tax income, otherwise known as GILTI, as well as other taxes on digital products and payroll taxes above a certain wage threshold. As most of you know, worldwide combined reporting is a method of corporate income tax reporting that requires multinational corporations to include the income and activities of all affiliated entities globally, not just US-based operations when calculating taxes owed to a state. Our partners in 9 states proposed worldwide combined reporting bills in their respective legislatures. While GILTI was designed to discourage US multinational corporations from shifting profits to low or no tax jurisdictions and tax havens, 2 of our partners proposed GILTI measures this year. Federal challenges following the July 3rd passage of the mega bill may complicate corporate tax provisions like GILTI, And we are working with our partners at ITEP to understand those implications. The 2017 federal tax cuts, there is a trend of states exploring ways that the tax system can evolve and how they can capture more revenue from multinational corporations in an increasingly online commerce system. Illinois' governor signed a law where businesses that move profits to other countries would be subject to the state's 9.5% corporate income tax. In New Mexico, they raised royalty rates and so revenue raised from the oil and gas industry, which advocates push for from both a revenue and climate protection standpoint. In Maine, a bill that would have changed the top corporate tax rate on earnings over $3.5 million passed both chambers with a bipartisan majority in the House. In Massachusetts, their corporate fair share bill, which would increase the share of GILTI that is taxed by the state from 5% to 50%, has 89 legislative co-sponsors, and their session is still underway. After so many years of tax breaks for corporations, both at the state and federal levels, corporate taxes remain a serious opportunity for raising revenue and highlight real challenges in the work ahead. We are seeing a growing trend, particularly after the 2024 elections, where folks are increasingly supportive of ways to ensure that large, profitable, and powerful corporations pay their fair share. Polling shows that the public is with us on the need to appropriately tax corporations. But as you know, the opposition is well-funded and has invested immensely in building, exploiting, and preserving these tax loopholes. Tax credits remain an essential way to increase progressivity and equity in the tax code. Each year, we are seeing more and more groups who have not worked on tax becoming interested in doing so, and oftentimes, child tax credits, or CTCs, are the first way they engage on the issue. So CTCs can be powerful not just from a child well-being standpoint, but also as a movement-building tool that helps grow power in tax justice. While tax credits are budget expenditures, they are an essential tool to target support for low and middle income families and have been linked to improvements in education, in child and maternal health, as well as reduced hunger and poverty. They also benefit businesses and the economy by putting money back into the pockets of the families who are going to spend it locally. More and more states across the political spectrum are pursuing tax credit bills, most prominently CTCs and earned income tax credits. Among our partners, we saw at least 12 CTC bills across 11 states, including 3 that were ultimately signed by governors. Even where states have existing CTCs, leaders are pursuing opportunities to make these more targeted, refundable, and increase the amount families are receiving. Just one example of this is Maine, where advocates push for a CTC that would double the current rate for children under 6 years old, while phasing out the benefit for high earners, which provides a bigger benefit to low and middle income families with young children. And this was included in Maine's final budget. For earned income tax credits, or EITCs, we saw more than 10 bills introduced across 9 states, including 4 bills that were signed by governors. Even in really difficult political climates for tax justice issues, EITCs, because of how widely they are known and because they are tied to the work, are often more realistic ways for improving equity in the tax code and helping families, and are also, like CTCs, powerful ways to strengthen in-state coalitions and movements. In Montana, while advocates fought hard against an income tax bill that ultimately did pass, they were also able to push for a component of the bill that doubled Montana's EITC from 10% to 20% of the federal credit. This is a great example of advocates fighting against harmful tax cuts that benefit the wealthy while continuing to educate and build alignment on the need to increase supports for working families. Early childhood education bills with policy tools emerged in several states. and reflect a national shift in strategy towards dedicated revenue streams for early childhood education, especially after New Mexico's success and increased public awareness of childcare inequities post-COVID. They are a part of a broader state movement to treat early childhood investment as core infrastructure instead of discretionary spending, tie new and progressive revenue sources directly to long-term early care funding, and experiment with durable, sustainable finance models, similar to New Mexico's constitutional and trust-based approach. These bills appeared in diverse political environments, showing that early childhood investment is increasingly bipartisan, even if funding mechanisms are different. Arizona focused on sin taxes, while Connecticut, Tennessee, and Washington lean more toward a social equity approach. Though these bills did not get all the way to the finish line, they provide unique opportunities for ballot measures in 2026, continued targeted budget fights in future sessions, and where revenue coalitions can partner with early childhood advocates, and cross-state collaboration between advocates pushing for permanent funds, surcharges, and more to support early learning. However, the history of tax justice is defensive work, partly because the right has been laser focused on tax as an essential issue, and conservative funders have heavily invested in their efforts. Defensive work continues to be essential across all political environments, even in the bluest of blue states. Regardless of the growth of our campaign and changes in tone and policy posture of elected officials, we're still not on a level playing field. And it's going to take so much more investment to truly change our collective work to go on offense. Here are just some of the themes that we've seen across states. There's an effort to try to ratchet down their income taxes, often considering eliminating them overall. This year, we saw multiple states, either by legislature or ballot, try to reduce or eliminate property taxes. Structural proposals are still on the table, but we are also seeing some pushback. There has been no significant rollback on these policies in decades. And tax incentives for films, data centers, and sports arenas continue to show up all over. There were some major wins in the defense space in 2025. In Louisiana, advocates with the support of SRA defeated Amendment 2, which would have capped personal income tax rates. And in Arizona, they defeated a proposal for more tax exemptions for private jet owners, while our friends in Nevada were able to stop a film tax credit in their legislature. And of course, there were losses. Just one example is Ohio's flat tax, which was included in the budget bill and overwhelmingly benefits the most wealthy Ohioans. As always, there is a lot of work to be done. While progress continues, the wealthiest continue to benefit from tax loopholes, while vital services for our communities are still underfunded. Even where state budgets avoided harmful cuts this past session, many were not successful in their efforts to fully fund vital programs that community members rely on. In 41 of our 50 states, high-income families are still taxed at a lower rate than everyone else. It just doesn't make sense. Even with the opportunity and the diversity and creativity of the tax justice bills outlined here, along with the incredible people-powered revenue movement the advocates are leading, we have not yet reached the point where these bills are moving en masse from committees and proposed budgets to being signed into law. Still, movement is happening because of the great efforts of you all and like-minded folks doing this work across the country. While it is clear many state legislators and leaders understand the opportunity and severity of the need for progressive revenue, work remains to educate many elected officials, especially our Democratic friends, around the popularity and necessity of these policies. Federal impacts are not yet accounted for in most of these state budgets. In light of the recent federal tax cuts, these state 2025 sessions feel like part one of this year's story. Many of the budgets that passed in May and June did not account for the massive reductions in federal funding that are on their way, putting states in a position to consider special sessions this fall. The federal bill is delivering tens of thousands of dollars in tax cuts to the wealthiest residents across our states, while low-income families will receive less than a fraction of that and are navigating devastating cuts to Medicaid and food assistance. State legislators and governors have an opportunity and a responsibility to harness this upwards transfer of wealth to make sure adequate and sustainable funding is there for state programs and relieve some of the affordability burden that working families are facing. These policies remain incredibly popular. Even in the reddest state legislative districts in our country, taxing corporations and the wealthiest households pulls over 60%. The mission of SRA is to support you in this work. Our team can assist you with communications, earned media, and digital resources. We can also provide support with bill analyses, design and writing, policy fact sheets and talking points, legislative testimony, data and polling, digital presence and plans, rapid response support at critical times, and most importantly, connections with other legislators and advocates from other states. So thank you all for being here and for all of your incredible work and dedication in a really tough world and political climate. You all give us hope and drive to continue doing this work. And now I will pass it over to the incredible Senator Noel Frame from Washington State for our panel discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erica, for that incredible presentation. I'm jazzed now just listening to that, and I feel like I probably know about a lot of this stuff already, but I'm excited. So just good afternoon, everyone. As just shared, I'm Noelle Frame. I represent the 36th district, which is the heart of Seattle in Washington State in the Senate. And in that role, I also serve as the Vice Chair of Finance for the Senate Ways and Means Committee, and I fly my flag as a bona fide tax nerd very proudly. I also have the distinct privilege of serving as a consultant through SIX to the Tax Justice Initiative through my company, Uncommon Bridges. And that Tax Justice Initiative, as you've heard, is a cohort of 16 states, including legislators and allied partners, organizing together to advance tax justice in the states. Our goal for the panel that we are just kicking off now is to both share lessons from the most recent legislative session and also share strategies for how states can lead on revenue in the future. And as you've heard in today's presentation already, despite deeply challenging conditions, legislators and partners involved in the Tax Justice Initiatives have made significant progress. And I'm so excited to hear from several of them this afternoon. I just want to take a moment, big shout out to SIX for supporting legislators like me and all the others in the 16 states that are involved in the Tax Justice Initiative. It's really hard to do this work in isolation, and it's great to have SIX that really has our back out there in the states. So thank you to SIX. But you also heard from Amber that states are facing major budget shortfalls and continue to need to find funding. And I'll just briefly share in Washington State by way of example, because we certainly met that criteria and frankly may continue to meet that criteria. In Washington State, as we headed into our legislative session, we faced a $16 billion shortfall over 4 years. And rather than repeat the mistakes of our last recession, where we cut like 25% of our budget and raised no new taxes back in 2009, we instead took a balanced approach, including a very painful $7 billion of cuts, but also $9 billion of new revenue. That new revenue included, as you heard earlier, a new higher tiered rate of 9.9% on capital gains over $1 million, changes to our estate tax to make it the most progressive in the nation, imposing new and increased surcharges on the largest businesses in our state, which includes, as you well know, some of the largest corporations in the world, and minimized harm to small and other businesses through other strategic limited increases. And we also led with a wealth tax, starting with our outgoing governor and including it as a cornerstone of both the Senate and House budget proposals. We made it further than we have yet in these 5 years, with a proposed 1% tax on assets in excess of $50 million. And while we did not get it across the finish line, we got it out of the state Senate, and it did not go unnoticed. That we have the votes in the Senate now, we're coming back stronger than ever next year. But even with that, we may even have to be set to reconvene a special session, depending on what happens with the disastrous policies of the Trump administration. As a very trade-driven state, the tariffs have a significant impact with the withholding of federal funds and disastrous policies like slashing Medicaid. We may yet have to come back, so we're keeping an eye on the feds. The good news, the people are with us on our quest to ask the wealthiest among us to pay what they owe. The bad news is that those wealthy corporations and individuals have very deep pockets, and they are funding lobbying and other campaigns to slow our progress. But as Amber said earlier, tax policy is people policy. And so now I'm excited to turn to our panel to hear more about what each of them is doing to fight for working families in their states through advancing tax justice legislation. So let me start quickly. We are going to move to introductions. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, but I'm going to call on each of them rather than popcorn it. So let's start with Rep. Afton Bain from Tennessee. Please go ahead and unmute and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm State Representative Afton Bain. I represent downtown Nashville and I'm a tax justice advocate along with my organizing and legislative partner in crime, Senator Charlene Oliver. She and I proposed multiple tax revision bills in a state that has one of the most regressive economic models in the country. Both of our bills, one ending the grocery tax by closing corporate tax loopholes, and the second is the data transaction tax to pay for universal child care. So those are two of our organizing vehicles. We've partnered with an organization, Tennessee for All, to do online or organizing statewide, organizing town halls across districts, and to really make it a focal point of the electoral cycle, both last year and hopefully imminently next year. In terms of the state of play in Tennessee, I'm sure this will resonate with a lot of you. We are facing the utmost austerity. We sent a letter on behalf of the Democratic caucus to the Commissioner on Finance asking for the amount of federal funding that would be cut and the impact on each of our state agencies, to which they still haven't replied. So we're facing a government that is non-transparent, unaccountable, and refusing to answer our information. So our government heads are coming into Nashville in August, probably to slash and cut budgets, which provides a massive organizing opportunity for folks like me to really provide a contrast to what their agenda is.
Rep. Bain, hold that thought, because we have a great question queued up about the impacts of the big disastrous bill at the federal level. So I'm excited to hear a little bit more about the organizing tactics you have planned. Fantastic. Let's switch now to Dr. and Representative Anna Eskamani from Florida.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I first just want to give a special shout out to my twin sister, Ida V. Eskamani, who also works at 6. I can never not do that. And so there are 2 Eskamanis, double trouble, as I like to say here in Florida. And with that said, I am proud to serve as a state house representative for District 42 in the state house here in the Orlando area. And of course, much like my counterparts, we have a very regressive tax structure in Florida as well. We're hyper reliant on sales tax as our main revenue generator, and are in a battle every single session regarding corporate tax loopholes. Right now, our governor, as was mentioned previously in the earlier presentation, is going after property taxes really as a tool to avoid his inaction on the property insurance crisis, while also, of course, trying to cut the legs off of local governments, consolidate power in state government, and make our system even more aggressive. My entryway into this work really just comes by chance. You know, I actually worked at Planned Parenthood of Southwest and Central Florida before I ran for office. So my origin story really is in reproductive freedom, and it continues to be a source of my focus in the legislature. But when I decided to run for office back when I was 27 years old and flipped my seat in 2018, I was given committee assignments that were not the ones I had checked off. And that included the Ways and Means Committee. And I realized very quickly that if I was going to succeed in this environment, member of the Minority Caucus, I would have to get really good, really fast on an array of topics that I've never had personal experience in, taxation being one of them. So I became one of the most aggressive members of the legislature on taxes, centering on state tax policy, and the intersections with federal tax breaks, the intersections of consumer protections and consumer rights. We're looking at tax policy not just as a revenue generator, but as an issue of equity. And I soon became the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee. I've served that capacity now for 7 years. And I'm probably one of the only members that will now request to be added to the Ways and Means Committee compared to the Appropriations Committee, because I see its value, and I also see the lack of knowledge on the topic, which allows for bad policy to go through. With that said, some of our successes have included a permanent tax break on children's diapers and adult incontinence products. I will say that we've also been able to stop some of the most egregious corporate tax breaks in Florida, but we are losing some ground, and I'm looking forward to talking about that and more with everyone here. So thanks again for having me.
You bet. And we've got another great question that you are poised to answer, Dr. Eskamani, about how it is to do work in states that are so typically opposed to this work. And I love that we are representing the worst tax code and the second worst tax code in the nation on this call and on this panel. So it's not a distinction anybody wants, but here we are. All right, Erica Vladimir from Invest in Our New York, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Senator. Hi, everyone. My name is Erica Vladimir. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the communications coordinator for Invest in Our New York. I have been with Invest in Our New York officially for about 3 years now, but I was a volunteer when it was just a volunteer organization called Budget Justice, starting back in 2019, 2020. So really been doing this work in New York for a few years now. We focus on making sure the richest New Yorkers pay their fair share, and it was really exciting that we got some of that done in 2021 when we were able to create a couple more tax brackets in our personal income tax structure, as well as raising the corporate tax slightly. And while that was projected to bring in $4 billion of new annual revenue every year, it actually brought in $10 billion of annual revenue. So we know what these small adjustments that don't actually make super rich people poor can do for the rest of our communities. We were able to finally fully fund our public schools here in New York, which is something that has been a 20-year crusade. We were able to start the first ever unemployment fund for undocumented New Yorkers who weren't able to be supported during the peak of the beginning of the COVID crisis for the unemployment insurance system. And so, you know, this is something that we have been fighting for with the federal budget scam that is going to hit us by about $23 billion a year. It is something that we know that we need to continue to fight for, even in a state, right? I know that a map was shown earlier in the presentation to show that New York is a little more progressive when it comes to its taxes. But we are also home to some of the, you know, richest people. We have some of the biggest amount of billionaires that call New York home. And in New York alone, just from 2017 to 2025, billionaires got $331 billion richer. So even in a progressive state like New York, there's a lot more work to do, and I'm excited to talk to you all about it.
We're so grateful to the work that you do and Invest in Our New York. You guys have been doing a big up job, and we all, believe me, we're watching what you're doing even in Washington. So thanks for your work. Ryan from Mainers for Tax Fairness, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll kick it over to the panel questions that we have.
Great. Thank you. And sorry for moving venues. We're actually at an organizational retreat in rural Maine right now. I was trying to find the best Wi-Fi. My name is Ryan Tipping, he, him. I live in Orono, Maine. I am the Campaigns and Strategy Director for Maine Center for Economic Policy. And I convene the Mainers for Tax Fairness Coalition, which is about 30 groups here in Maine, from teachers and nurses to people who care about addiction services, all the way around environmental groups. We work on tax fairness, both state and national. Before this, I served in the State House in Maine for 8 years. For 4 of those years, I was chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Taxation. And before that, I was an organizer with a grassroots organization here in Maine. So I've been working on this issue for quite a while. And I'm excited that There's a lot of focus on it right now, and a lot of energy behind it.
Awesome, Ryan. Thank you for being with us. Well, let's start with some of the questions. We've pre-populated a few for our panel, and then we will go to the audience afterwards. We already have a few great questions. So Dr. Bain, I'm going to go to you first and kind of try to give you a preview on this. In our earlier presentation, we started this briefing setting the context that the Trump administration has passed the largest transfer of wealth from the working class to billionaires, frankly, stealing from essential programs like Medicaid that working families rely on. How does this moment impact your work to advance tax justice in your state? Would love for you to speak to that opportunity that you alluded to earlier.
Yes, and sorry, I don't, my camera's not functioning, but hopefully it'll come back on. So this is a moment in time where Tennessee leads the country in the rate of rural hospital closures, 1 million on Medicaid, TennCare, which is our Medicaid program. And so for me, I think the big ugly bill provides an opportunity for those of us in the legislature to really point out to who the villain is in this story. And I think that's been really challenging the past 15 years of Republican supermajority rule. And so it's very clear and linear as to who is responsible for these cuts. We are already seeing organizations like Second Harvest, which is our food bank, having to lay off staff, having to decline food that is arriving due to USDA cuts, and it's just ongoing. So what I did, I organized statewide calls. It was particularly one after the big ugly bill was passed to inform folks as to how they can leverage August recess with their federal delegation to put pressure on them, at least to, build the narrative around what will be, I think, salient for 2026 election. So our federal delegation doesn't, feel responsible for what's happened, but I do think that this provides a shifting landscape that we absolutely need to take advantage of in our legislative capacities. And like I said, unfortunately, I'm in a state government that won't answer my emails, even though I represent 60,000 voters. So it is we've entered the dark era officially, and all I can do is ensure that we are, elevating things, raising these issues to the public consciousness so that folks, when things really start to get bad and devolve, that it is quite clear who is responsible for this.
I'm happy to have anybody else answer that question if they like. I'll say one thing that we're paying attention to in Washington is those calculations on what that big, beautiful bill means for our state and how much of a windfall the taxpayers are getting in our state. Because frankly, y'all, that's money on the table. So I know we're all looking out for that. Anybody else want to answer that question? Otherwise, we'll popcorn to the next question, but just want to make sure I give our speakers a chance.
I will say one thing that we're thinking about here in New York, I mentioned the $23 billion number before, what New York stands to lose. So 10 of that is actually going to be hitting the New York state budget directly. But what we're seeing in that other $13 billion is money that isn't necessarily connected to our budget, but is also connected, goes straight to localities, right, from the federal government, which is something that is going to be lost. Things like hospitals closing, and the jobs that are going to be impacted by that as well. So we're really looking at this holistically and trying to make sure that the conversation here in New York is much broader than what's the deficit we're going to see in the budget, because we know that there's going to be more of a direct impact on people's lives. And some of that is, calculable, some of it is not. But really, want to say what just echo what Rep. Bain said. I, as the comms professional on this team, love that we have like a loud and proud villain that we can point to. And that is really helpful in this fight as we try and get more people to start pushing our state legislature to mitigate and combat these cuts. And that's really tough because our state legislature and our governor are sitting here and saying things like, we can't, backfill all of these cuts. We're not going to be able to. And they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. To them, it's, well, we can't do it, so we're not going to do anything. But what we can do is make them look like the heroes to this very stark villain by saying, you can at least mitigate these cuts. So that's something we're working on really hard in New York.
I love that, Erica. That's fantastic. Ryan, you want to add something real quick?
Yeah, I would just echo, we're looking at like rural hospitals closing and how it's not a matter of like closing a main care gap or, a Medicaid gap here in Maine. we're also looking at what other policies need to be on the table and paid for with, tax increases on the wealthy to offset the terrible things that are going to happen because of this bill. So I would echo that. We're also seeing a lot more just willingness to consider this from Democratic legislators who in January on Facebook were saying, like, I'm not going to touch the income tax code, or are suddenly all of a sudden saying, there's money out there, let's get it.
Very much agree with that sentiment. All right, Dr. Escamani, I want to ask you a question operating in a state like Florida. So what is it like being a tax justice champion in states like yours that have historically been opposed to fair tax systems? Like I said, you now have the distinction of having the worst and most regressive tax code in the nation. We'd just love to hear about the challenges and opportunities and any tips that you've learned that other states can leverage, and I'm taking notes.
Yeah, I mean, we're number one in like all the worst ways in Florida. And so this is one example of many. However, as I mentioned earlier, we've had some success. I mean, part of it is the fact that tax policy that is progressive is by default populist. And so we are able to build bridges with our constituents of different political ideologies and even find common ground with our colleagues. So I think a part of it is building those relationships and really trying to find the common thread around corporate accountability. Oftentimes it gives you an opportunity to kind of call out the faux populism at the same time, which is important from a political perspective. But finding those partnerships is truly what matters. I think a part of it too is when the rubber hits the road, a lot of my colleagues in the majority party also realize how bad this policy is. And not only does that slow down its passage, but it can also grant a veto or at least help us mitigate harm. Now, oftentimes, this is a multi-session process. So I think my first piece of advice is be realistic to the fact that most good bills in states like Florida just take time. I mentioned our tax break on children's diapers and adult incontinence products. This took us about 4 to 5 sessions to get through. As simple as the policy is, it's a huge fiscal to the state of Florida. And so it took us a while to actually get it to that finish line. And it took some compromise along the way. On property taxes, which is a very active topic right now, we have been able to dramatically slow down the effort to eliminate property taxes because we've created opportunities of hyperlocal conversations that have uplifted the voices of colleagues across the aisle who have realized that this policy proposal is really bad for rural communities and really bad for what we call fiscally constrained counties in Florida. Florida is home to 67 counties. We're a huge state. My district is much more dense, much more urban. Obviously, we rely on property taxes for public education funding and infrastructure and so forth. But the largest expenses for local governments is police and fire. And so part of it for us too has been uplifting this point of, oh, Julie wanted to fund the police. We thought you guys were against that, right? And then when we pivot to the legislature, a lot of my conservative colleagues represent these areas where the major tax revenue are going to be property-based, but because so much of the property is rural or public, i.e. the main employers are schools and prisons, like they realize that they cannot afford to lose property taxes either. So we're shifting the narrative, I think, is going to be your friend in tough states like Florida. Like you really have to take back the conversation. And again, this corporate accountability piece, if you are brave enough to challenge a tax break that does not make sense, right? So for example, we have this program in Florida that's titled the Urban High Crime Tax Break. It's supposed to be a tax break designed to eliminate blight in areas of high crime to create high-paying jobs. It's supposed to attract these new businesses to an area. The 2 largest companies right now who benefit based on how the geographical zones are drawn are Universal Studios, a theme park, and Publix, a very well-established grocery store. These are not companies that are new to Florida. They're not leaving Florida. And they do not need this tax break, right? And they're not creating high-paying jobs from it either. If you're brave enough to challenge that and talk about that, then not only do you stand out in the crowd, if you will, among your peers, but it has this broad-based appeal to folks of different political backgrounds. And I've been able to find common ground on some of these points of just corporate accountability and and cronyism. One last example I'll give is a major fight we have in Florida every year over the tourism development tax, which is also known as the bed tax. So long story short, being a tourism state, we generate hundreds of millions of dollars from visitors at the local level. Obviously, at the statewide level, about 15% of our general revenue is from tourism, 1.5. Smaller than I think most people think. 85% of sales tax revenue is coming from residents, taxpayers who are engaging in a regressive structure. But in addition to the sales tax revenue, the bed tax is for locals, but it's very restricted. It can only be spent on tourism and promotion of tourism. So we have been grabbing this issue and pointing to examples of, with the money that is generated from TDT, we could spend it instead on trains for every community. We could give universal childcare to our residents. We can do this, we can do that. So I think when you're talking about tax policy, especially in red states, one of the other tactics I would offer is provide visualizations, because this is not a tax break. This is silent spending, right? Again, that narrative flip, right? This isn't a tax break. This is us giving away money to corporations who don't need it. And that money could instead go to providing XYZ service for this many teachers, right? Or this many families. So I do think a part of it is to make the topics more accessible, not just to the public, but also to press. Because let's be real, in a state like Florida, we don't have a very strong press corps in general, let alone on tax policy. So you really have to break it down, make it less complicated, and give visual examples to get more people to buy into the policy that you're championing.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's been amazing to watch the press adopt our narrative in Washington State over the last 15 years. It is working. Well, I want to tee up a question to Erica and Ryan before we go to the Q&A, but I will say we're getting some questions from the audience about a little bit about Dr. Escamani was just talking about on messaging, a little bit about what Rep. Bain talked about earlier on organizing. So we can get back to that in a few minutes if others want to add. But Erica, for now, I would love to just share, as those of us who are not from New York, it's been really exciting to see revenue be so central to the mayor's race. And I'm curious if you can share, how you've seen the narrative on tax and revenue change in New York over the last few legislative sessions and how it's showing up in this current political moment in New York.
Yeah, so just to give a quick background for those who don't know, in New York City, the mayoral election is coming up in November. We just had the primaries. Most often, whoever wins the Democratic primary is the one who becomes the mayor. And tax justice champion, Assemblymember Zohran Mamdani, overwhelmingly was elected by Democrats. Oh, I just got chills even like saying that. I have to be honest, which is great. Beating out a billionaire, former and disgraced ex-governor Andrew Cuomo, who was backed by billionaires in a PAC. They spent over $22 million for him, and he lost embarrassingly. But I digress. And so having that really talked about in the richest city in the country, right? One of the richest cities in the world, having a tax champion talking about the things that we can do in a very consistent way in his messaging, right? Assemblymember Mamdani had like 3 points. We were going to make our buses fast and free was one of them. Universal childcare was another, and then one of his really cool policy ideas of government-run grocery stores to lower your cost of groceries. These are things that everyday people, whether you are relying on SNAP benefits or you're middle class here in New York City, are thinking about, and it's something that he was really able to resonate. And again, I think because we had an identifiable villain that all these billionaires were throwing their money at. I mean, Mike Bloomberg alone, I think, put in like $8 million, by himself for Andrew Cuomo. Those things made it really easy to have that strong messaging that I think Zohran was able to carry, and a lot of his organizers were organizations that were supporting him. On the higher level, the state level, a lot of it was it took some time, more so to help people understand that when we say we want to raise taxes, we actually want to raise them on the super rich. And so, in our first few years of the Invest in Our New York campaign, there was a lot of work done doing just teach-ins. And sometimes those were in person, and other times those were on Zoom, especially, in 2021 when we were still having major waves of COVID and people were isolating more. We really took to Zoom just to make sure we could talk to people and help them understand the bills in a way that was just really simple. But we also talked about the history of New York. We talked about who lives here, who doesn't live here, who's moving. And then we also made sure that we got a really credible poll done. And I think that was really a turning point for us. That was, in 2023, we did a poll with Siena College, which is very reputable across the country, but especially here in New York. So we got the attention of the press, right? Those things are really important. Dr. Eskamani talking about not having a big press corps in Florida. It's hard to get the attention of press in New York because they have to do everything. And so being able to give them things where it didn't necessarily become, how do we get Invest in Our New York in the press? How do we just get our movement in the press? How do we get this information in the press? So making sure that anytime, Governor Hochul said that she's not going to raise income taxes or taxes on corporations, they could then say, but this is also supported by a majority of New Yorkers. And I think that also helped us legislatively too, when we were working with people who weren't champions in the first place.
Great. And you mentioned the study about who's leaving New York, and I know we got a question about it with the Massachusetts thing earlier. If I recall, it's not the richest people in the world that are leaving New York, Erica. Am I correct?
You are 100% correct, Senator. Yeah, it is actually the Fiscal Policy Institute here in New York did a study through the American Community Survey that showed it's actually low income and working class and middle income New Yorkers, largely Black and brown New Yorkers who cannot live here because they can't afford things like childcare and rent. And so that's who leaving. We are actually gaining more millionaires, either because they're moving here or people are becoming millionaires, people who were like just on that cusp.
Yeah, I will say I found that to be one of the most effective counter narratives to, but the billionaires will move. And we're like, no, they're not. And you know who is moving? The people who can't afford to live here anymore in the community that we all love. It's a very effective argument because everybody knows and feels that in their bones every single day. So Erica, thank you for flagging that. Ryan, I want to get to you and I want to hear a little bit about the story of what's happening in Maine. Can you just tell us a little bit about the revenue movement that happened this session and tell us a little bit about the success and sort of what you would attribute that to?
Sure. So, we are at a critical moment after the federal bill. We have been organizing, and I really value what SIX and SRI does, trying to build power, build institutional memory, and build like organizing capacity in places so that when the moment arrives, you can win. And that's the name of the game on a lot of this stuff. But we're in Maine, we're a purple state. We're 1.3 million people. I don't know how many city blocks that is in New York exactly, but it's a pretty small state. And we've been limited to the wins we've gotten by full opposition from a Democratic governor, Governor Mills, to tax fairness measures. This year, we saw some cracks in that wall. We were able to pass two key initiatives. One doubles our version of the CTC for children under 5, and we paid for it by phasing it out for wealthier families. And we passed an increase on a real estate transfer tax on homes over $1 million, something that previously had been vetoed by this governor through organizing, through work, building a coalition in the legislature, and through presiding officers who we've been working with since they were on committees that had nothing to do with taxes, trying to build up this issue. So we have had some wins. We've also had some really great roll call victories that didn't culminate in full wins. A millionaire's tax, a corporate income tax, and then a full restructuring of our tax code that gave a tax cut to about 70% of the population while creating 2 new income brackets for higher incomes. And it would have raised a ton of revenue. Those all got really great votes in the floor in both chambers. One failed the House, but we're working on flipping those when it comes back. And, we've built a solid coalition, a bunch of different groups that all have heard no time and time again from the appropriations table, whether that's direct care workers, child care workers, teachers, people who try and manage municipalities and pay for things like roads and police departments, making sure that they were all talking from the same talking points, rejecting this idea that we don't have enough money to do this. Yes, we do. You just have to pass these bills that got majority votes out of the taxation committee that are headed to the floor. This is not some foreign concept anymore. With that, we've had a lot of success. We still see the same institutional pressures against these bills, whether you call them fancy Democrats or, certain communities where, people just still think it's a third rail or still swim in circles where this is like anathema. We've actually pushed back on those. One of the proudest moments, we had 2 members of Democratic leadership block a millionaire's tax in the Senate this year. And we were able to organize with their donors, putting pressure on them to change. We've had some really great success working with some of the donors who have come out and realized this is a matter of having a democracy or not. This is a matter of having an institution that supports people and protects them when they need it the most or not. And they need to step up and making sure that we, again, had things in place for when the moment is right to collect those stories, whether it's, making sure we had comm staff at the hearings to turn those moments of testimony into reels, into TikTok videos, or making sure that those people that we identified to come speak were also reaching out in their networks, flipping votes for floor votes later on. So we've had some success, and this is a long-term project. This has to continue to be a long-term project, and we do need to continue investing in long-term organizing to make sure we are there when the moment is right. And this is absolutely a critical moment.
Ryan, great segue. I mean, you just did a great job speaking to organizing just in the context of a budget crisis and everything else. And here we are in this moment where we have a, manufactured crisis with the federal government doing what they're doing. I promise panelists, I give you an opportunity if anybody had anything else they wanted to add about the organizing opportunities in this moment, given the federal administration. Dr. Eskamani, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just add to this excellent point. At the end of the day, and I want to be thoughtful to, see through space. I'm be careful with my language here, but so much of the last election cycle was based on grievances among the working class, right? And those grievances are valid. Like, we cannot ignore the fact that everyday Americans feel left out by their government, they feel left behind by their elected officials, and they don't feel seen or represented, which is why there is a thirst for these out loud, proud, bold candidates like Zorhan Mandami, who are setting a tone that I would argue that others will need to follow. The challenge, of course, is the fear and the risk associated with the courage to have these conversations, because as we noted, you will be up against a machine. And in Florida, another example is utility companies. So we have a regulated utility monopoly structure in Florida. There's less than 5 investor-owned utility companies in Florida. The largest is a company called Florida Power and Light. They have 11 million customers. To give you perspective, half the state of Florida is theirs. You don't get to choose where you live, dictates your utility company. And I have went after them many times. I mean, I just sent a letter to the Public Service Commission denouncing their most recent rate hike request, which is historic in a bad way, the largest ask for a rate hike in American history. And I could only get maybe 4 to 5 of the lawmakers to sign on with me, right? And so it's so important for us to set the trend, because I would argue that once you set the trend and you win because you're setting that trend, right? Because your constituents are thanking you, they're supporting you, they're also even donating to you, because you can say, I'm not backed by these guys, I'm gonna be backed by you, right? So it becomes also a political strategy, right? For building grassroots support. The more of us who can do that and prove that it's the right thing to do, and we're strategic, we're diligent, we're on message, we're coordinated, the more that we can do that, then the easier it will be to persuade some of the folks who maintain the status quo, persuade them to co-sign. And I also am a firm believer of calling people in before I call them out. So I try to invite folks to sign on to this letter. I try to invite you to come to my tax policy panel, right? Like learn the ins and outs of this system, because I think once you learn it, you will realize that it is broken. And so don't be afraid to teach it to others and to have conversations with folks who historically have been oppositional to you, because I think that evolution is a part of our long-term success.
You know, it's also a connection to a great question that we had from the audience, which just a question about like, how long did it take each of us to pass a progressive revenue thing? How many times did we fail? Because I think it's important for us to talk about progress. I think Erica talked about in her presentation that it took us 10 years to pass our capital gains tax in Washington State. We're on year 5 of the wealth tax proposal and making real progress every session. Anybody else have a good example of how many times it took losing before you were actually able to get a win?
I mean, it's hard. Especially a state like Florida. I mean, one of my favorite Event Brothers songs said, you gotta lose a couple of fights to win. And I think that's the mentality in some states we have to have. But also remember, we have to measure wins differently. Like I can't always measure a win by passing a bill. Sometimes I'm measuring a win by a bill that I stopped. And I think that's important too. And during Trump 1.0, you know, the state of Florida co-signed with his first tax break bill federally, which hurt our revenue generation at the state level as well. And when I first got elected, there was policy to continue what's called a piggyback bill, to continue that structure and not allow for Florida's corporate income tax rate to go back to its original ratio, because it was reduced temporarily. And we were able to allow for it to go back to its original level. So again, that wasn't necessarily a bill that I filed. It was a bill that we fought back against and that we held the line on keeping the CIT to its original percentage rate. And so that was a win for us. So to be thoughtful too to how you measure those wins.
Agreed. Right. I thought I saw you trying to come off mute. And I also want to, Rep Bain, I know your camera is just misbehaving, and so I can't see if you're trying to come off of mute or anything to say anything, but feel free just to unmute and jump in. Technology is a beast sometime. Ryan, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I just want to say, you know, no tax pledge or anything is absolute. Like we have been able to move people off positions that they were solidly on 2-4 years ago by continuing pressure. I think the other thing is, if you know you're going to lose hard and use it as a cudgel, and make it common sense so much so to your champions that they are there and organizing without effort when they're talking about the holes in the budgets to come. Make it common sense among the people who you don't have to fight too hard to win, to build a culture around it.
We have about 90 seconds left, and I want to tee up if anybody's got a great sort of defensive example, corporate tax breaks, anything like that that you're really proud of. Erica, Rep Bain, sorry, Dr. Escamani, trying to make everybody doctor. Rep Bain, Erica, anything that you would flag as a great example of a defensive measure?
I wanted to flag, I don't know if this is happening in other folks' states, but the Republicans put forth, they're going to put forth a constitutional amendment we don't have a popular ballot referendum process in Tennessee, but they passed a moratorium on state property taxes. We don't have a state property tax, but inevitably it's red meat for them. And there were very few, because it is a politically sensitive issue in Tennessee. There were very few Democrats that voted against it. Now, I knew strategically, for those tax savants on here, we basically revised our franchise tax last year, and I was trying to figure out why. And it was because it's the last remaining progressive tax mechanism we have on the books. And then what I realized is that this constitutional amendment that then we'll probably vote on next year as to a moratorium on statewide property taxes is actually the legal basis that they're going to use to then file a lawsuit to get rid of the franchise tax in its entirety. So just to say that, like, they're being strategic, we have to out strategize them, because that's exactly what they're trying to do.
Thank you so much. Erica, 30 seconds, go for it.
Yeah, this goes to something that Ryan was saying, that sometimes, and what Dr. Escamani was saying, that sometimes like a win is also like how much you didn't lose. And so in this past budget in New York, the governor wanted to cut tax percentages by like 0.2% for like the bottom 5 brackets. And that was going to maybe put $2 a day in most people's pockets. And it was also regressive because the people who make the most were also going to get the highest tax cut. And it was also going to mean that we lost $2 billion a year in public revenue that we need here in New York State. We weren't able to fully get that off the table, but we were able to help educate our state lawmakers for them to understand how toxic and actually bad that was going to be, so that that was actually cut to a 0.1% tax break again. So the governor gets her, like, win messaging wise, and we were able to keep some of the public revenue. So it's not a full win, but like we didn't lose as bad as we could have.
Thank you, Erica, for that example and just bringing it home. We are at the end of our time for our panel discussion, but I just want to say thank you to all of you. Again, as a fellow bona fide tax nerd with you all, I've enjoyed this conversation so much and hearing from each and every one of you. So thank you so much. And at this point, I am going to throw it back to the other Eskamani on our call as we flag Dr. Eskamani's incredible sister, Ida V. Ida, back to you to close us out.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, you are seeing double. I want to give such deep gratitude to Senator Frame and to all of our panelists, to the State Revenue Alliance, and to each of you for being here with us today. This briefing is a springboard towards our year-round and essential organizing. We know that we are entering uncharted territory that was named with Trump's big ugly mega bill. Special legislative sessions are looming, and state revenue offers an opportunity. Research shows over the next decade, the top 1% are set to receive $1 trillion in tax cuts from Trump's mega bill. That's funding working families depend on, left on the table by the federal government and those beholden to the ultra wealthy, but states should and must tax it. Proponents of the mega bill are also dead set on shifting the blame to states. That's why they've timelined the tax breaks and the cuts to benefits the way they did. State tax justice champions are critical in this moment to fund essential programs and build an affirmative vision for how government can truly work for people. But in order to win, we need to organize in every direction, bottom up, across state lines, and beyond our issue silos. We need to build more tax justice champions in our caucuses and in our coalitions. We need to name the villains and tax them. The tax fight is everyone's fight, and we have much work to do, which is why we're so grateful that y'all have stayed on for this conversation and continue to do the work year round. As a reminder, we'll be sending this presentation and recording to all registrants along with our contact information. These are the kind of briefings we can bring to your state caucus, to your state coalitions. We can connect you with tax champions, legislators, and advocates in neighboring states to help debunk the narratives that you're fighting in your states, because we know our opposition is highly coordinated across all lines and worldwide. And SIX and our partners are also working on a few resources right now to empower you. We're working on a special session toolkit in response to the ugly mega bill, and also a summary of some of the efforts state legislators have already done to take back where those were frozen federal dollars. And a big shout out to legislators in Maryland and New York who've been leading the way on these really uncharted territories, but really important conversations about how we can make sure that the money that is ours stays in our states. And finally, we invite you to join SIX's Economic Power Project, where we organize legislators, legislative staff, and partners year-round towards a vision of building inclusive state economies that advance justice and prosperity for all. But both SIX and the State Revenue Alliance are here to support in our collective efforts towards building this better vision and government we can truly believe in. Thank you for being here. Until next time, goodbye.